Israel has historically been the target of criminal attacks, such as the attack against them before the forming of Israel, at which point you have many arrangements from the Nazi Party, which were created by the Confederacy, who sought to slaughter European Jews, at which point the trigger for this was given under the assumption that all of them, including the small children, would have consented and gladly given their life in order to have manifest their position in the forming of Israel, at which point the history of that being the legal concept has been the subversion of the concept of maintaining a constitution, which would generate a check and balance function of multi branches of their government, which had not happened under the theory that the act of doing so would actively be subversive to the original deal in secret, which manifested. At which point you have the subversion irony of them being formed off of the blood of those murdered under an insurance fraud mechanism, or the function of them forming a constitution would not be particularly interesting. Now, Trump's defense details special prosecutor misconduct by Jay Bratt and many of the other offenses targeting Trump, similar to David Boles, have been conducted off of the basis of the Nazi overthrow of the United States, which has actively sought to get Trump's permission, as he famously has said that corruption um, and mismanagement has fundamentally been a part of the American system, and that he knows it because he uses it, which is the functional problem with inside the United States, that the subversion of the rule of law to destabilize through chaos has actively come back and bit everyone in the ass, at which point the catastrophic subversions of that chaos is investing in the criminal injuries against the general public, as that corruption has engaged in such things as the crash of '08, has engaged in the major terrorist attack of 9/11 and many of the other major functions that have moved the United States by the use of fraud, at which point the government use of secrecy in order to subvert national security is an act of insurrection by the Confederacy, which has systematically informed everything that has been injuring the United States, which is the deep state. Obama knew everything about Joe Biden's crimes. We need to understand that this is a systemic problem throughout the entire United States and its allies. The corruption and intimidation by the double agents in America, coercing the allies of the United States for high crimes, such as the reinforcement of sedition by blocking David from forming his form of government, which generates his legal functions of the government, which would subvert the crimes of the insurrectionists, which is a part of the takings clause, generating their obligation to have paid David for everything that they have taken for the government function of sedition, which is not a legal clause, at which point their non legal argument generates exclusively liability for their insurrection, as treason, sedition, and high crimes is their base identity of their criminal arrangements. Um, you need to know how to fight and defeat the woke. And a lot of that is just based upon the objective reality. The acknowledgement of the secret functions blocks essential functions through the redactions that were necessary to understand the context of all of the arrangements, which materially generates alternative answers, as they've pre-crafted through the strawman arguments the entirety of their war strategy and the dismantlement of the United States, such as their support for communism historically, which generates the larger spells, such as their generation of all of the negative aspects of communism, such as Stalinism and Maoism, which has generated the catastrophic damages which they have planned and generated from scratch and are seeking to reproduce if the United States does not adequately restrain them. You need to understand that these attacks include the creation of the attack on masculinity, uh, why um, why the Iraq War has changed the world and Confederates lie to do war crimes, exponentially compounds on itself in all of the functions of the primary corruption of the Confederacy, such as J. Sekulow Civil War or William Barr's Civil War, which is basically just white nationalist hate crimes for the sake of their nonsense. Now, at the original layer, if they did not obstruct it, the military intelligence, having been discovered, compels the government to release the information to the general public, as it having been invested as a public source has to become a public source, has to be publicly consumable, generating the information to the relevant parties inside the public, who would then begin to reinforce their position in the example of forming David as the patriarchy from the Legend of David Company. At which point, the assumption that if they did not make that investment, if they left it alone, the thing that the investigation found, that if they had not invested in would have happened according to their credibility would have been that Don Sr. Boles, not being obstructed, would have actively formed his arrangements in the school, forming of the School of Hard Knocks, which would have actively been used as the education for all of David's siblings, including David, in the forming of his trades in the generation up to his plan to form the brokerage from their projections, at which point David would have been using that leverage by getting his dad to facilitate the advancement of the brokerage, allowing David to build the credit from a small child under those trades through the company medium, which generates the exponential ability for him to have generated the matured credit score and max loan cap, which would have been necessary to make the investment into the crash of '08, which they assumed that he would have been able to have stopped on the basis of his historic works, which they assumed he was going to be doing anyways. That if they didn't stop him, then that would have been something he would have been working on for a long time. Um, until finally he solved most of the problem. And that's the first layer without any tampering. The base confidence is he's the one to do it. And their insider trading and subversions generating the functions of the criminal arrangements and targeting of the United States key functions engages in the corruption of the wizard communism, which is the active overthrowing of capitalism for the destruction of the United States and the redetermining and recentering of predetermined winners and losers and contract owners and contract failures on the basis of their centrally planned economy, such as is derived by their crime market, which is the alternative to their payment. Now, the Secret Service gets paid in status instead of money because they view that their work is worth more and they aren't going to um, get paid enough, so they're allowed to get away with crimes, which generates the active exchanges of the crime market itself, including the CIA's function of trading on the black market, such as the narcotics and others, at which point you have the mechanism of their exponential crime syndicate, which they've been forming as the alternative payment to cash, which has predetermined winners and losers, such as would view David as the original patriarchy to be the highest form of adversarial threats to their criminal racket, which is their alternative to financial remedy, such as their obstruction of all forms of the original market. Take, for instance, the insurance structure from the celebrities. Now, necessary force in order to win requires Jay to have acquired beating the market price for the contracts in order to have gained the influence, which requires him to have actively backed the success of celebrities becoming and advancing as celebrities, at which point those celebrities funding their engagements would have living conditions such as Johnny Depp and his yachts and his wine, which would actively have those platforms as a business meeting location, at which point all of his wine and yacht activities would actively be maintained as a cost of business maintenance with the appropriate amount of contracts in order to sustain itself. Now, while Johnny Depp would have been predetermined to conduct his celebrity functions to maintain his high status and the investment into the amenities, he would need to have hired a princess to have managed the nobility side of things, not just his entertainment of the guests conducting the business meeting. At which point, the forming of the princess nobility structure is on the theory that from the military intelligence, the obstructed communities, such as the black community, would have actively had to conducted risk management against the threats against their existence, such as the engagement of not testing the white nationalists' eagerness to forming a lynch mob, at which point their high grade investments from the projected $15 an hour from the very beginning into the insurance market requires them to have made the investments that would not um, generate negative attention, such as their investment into their women engaging in high levels of education, such as the standardization of their acquiring of PhDs, and other subversions to the threats against them that they would collectively accept as the traveling insurance function, at which point the position of the normalization that women would be in charge of that would transfer into the Rosie the Riveter's function, who, by definition, being thrown out of the factories and the workplace when the men come back from war, needed something to do, at which point they actively joining that insurance market would have been a highly desirable way for them to have maintained their wealth, their financial influence, their political influence, and others, at which point the function would have normalized under David's business network, assuming that he would turn into a kingdom, would facilitate the structure of nobility for the common civilians who are able to acquire a certain degree of wealth under a system of personal luxury versus collective community or network interest, or stones versus wheat type of investments. At which point, the high consumable wheat are for everyone's enjoyment of the amenities, and the stones being the more solid aspects of nobility, such as the creation of long-standing buildings, such as the forming of universities, such as the forming of castles and the like, at which point the function of them having acquired the position of the investment type to have specialized in creating that maintained noble structure is primarily leaning towards the women being able to do that, at which point he would have to pick a princess to form the nobility side of things in order to have stabilized the function, at which point he has the major investors, he has him and his amenities, and he has the nobility, and David provides the customer list under the brokerage's contract schedule. Now, these and other obstructed contracts are a part of the takings clause, which requires the government to pay for having taken them, at which point the projection that they were stopping it from existence requires them to pay the projected liability of its success, at which point their blocking of it was on the basis of the corruption in order to prevent the more successful version of the market, at which point their blocking of the higher success is the managing of the market through communism to reduce competition, to reduce market effectiveness, which generates the ability to coerce the general public, at which point the government doing the taking was by double agent white nationalists who hate the country for criminal objectives against the nation. Now, the engagement of that taking requires the restoration of those projections for the original successes stolen, which facilitates the maintenance of them having to calculate the superior value of those exchanges in the sustained mechanism which generates the bill. The cooperation of the United States with allies in the white nationalist overthrow of their nations includes the position of the military industrial educational complex, which is the function of having subcontracted wizards inside the educational system in order to have reshaped the general communities for systematic frauds which collapse the stability of the society in their war crimes, at which point, as an enemy terrorist of war to the United States, there is an obligation to engage in the necessary corrections against their stability or existence, such as their fraudulent position with Fauci, which has conducted gain of function research through the various universities and others, such as the use of, I think it was Oregon State University, um, which engage in many bioresearch functions, such as the increase of the spreading of diseases as a terrorist extortion against targets that they view as highly valuable to the Americans, which they want to remove for military. Now, the thing about the military industrial educational complex is even a nerd who's a wimpy nobody loser can still kill someone if they shoot a gun. So the active ability of overpowering those who are used to being weak and looking for retaliation or some way to retaliate or to feel important for once in their miserable, pathetic lives facilitates the active encouragement of the use of bullying through war crimes, at which point the catastrophic engagement of their personal revenge cycles manifests their terrorist strategies as they systematically destabilize the country on the basis of their misapplication of false experiments so that they could feel important. It is not the right in a constitutional republic for them to be conducting many of these operations, which are criminal felonies, at which point their false permission to conduct the criminal felonies is white nationalist insurrection. Now, many of the eugenics programs, which are derived by the military industrial education system, have actively been condemned in history, but having been condemned, were forced to shut down. And at that point, the white nationalists forced to shut down basically didn't even move in many of the cases. They just changed the name of their criminal organization as they switched the posters and they stayed in the building, at which point these operations haven't substantively been fixed yet. And there is no interest in fixing them so long as the Americans are restrained by the white nationalist parasite, which blocks the function of the immune system, which innately understands that the parasite is a foreign threat to the body. So let's take, for example, the white nationalist, nerdy military industrial educational complex, which, viewing the School of Hard Knocks from Don Boles Sr. as a challenging system to their arrangement, they would have actively encouraged the criminal targeting of that school from being able to be created, at which point the specific targeting of individuals or groups without cause on the basis of that policy disqualifies it as criminal, at which point the act of the obstruction of it until they get past that racist policy facilitates the manifestation of this aversion. At which point, the ex post facto and Bill of Attainder didn't make it legal, it just made it more racist. Committing more crimes is the entirety of the construct. At which point, more guilt is not less guilt, is not permission to do what you were not allowed to do other ways. What you aren't allowed to do in public, you aren't allowed to do in private. What you cannot acquire by public influence, you cannot acquire by secret influence. At which point blocking the School of Hard Knocks obstructed the educational function, which includes the assumption of David's character from the projection, who would have been able to have invested according to the arrangement in the educational system, generating the confidence of his family, who would have conducted their investments into that system, trading off of the arrangements of the paper trading following the valuation of the advisor specifically guiding him, at which point the manifestation of the system is the creation of the credit, which they would have been conducting under David's management, which would have facilitated the ability for the credit to have assimilated exponentially. At which point, if they would have started off with a 30% system, then basic strategies such as tracking the credit cards and loan offices, etc., would have facilitated the status quo investments, which led them to the assumption that David was going to find the crash of '08 before it happened, which, from long-standing experience, meant that he would have actively been tracking the functions of their exponential rises and falls, uh, having been able to competently maintain in the building of the portfolio off of the basis of tracking it competently, which they had certified that they believed that he would have, especially with the reinforcement of the advisors facilitating exponential deeper investigations into the function of the actual market activities, at which point the higher grade due diligence nitty gritty, boring part of trading would have been actively a part of his education, which would have facilitated his ability to have found these errors, which facilitate the calculation into the projections in each direction possible, facilitating the normalization of the diversity of his trading techniques as a character, which would have manifested these investments into the act of building the credit off of the study of the market at the exponential rate, at which point the increase of his credit would have actively been funded by the profits from the investments, which, settling each time through, compounds exponentially the rate of the credit as it becomes its own series of fortune by the exchanging of debts or margin. They had every confidence in David's capacity to have compounded these profits through the various mechanisms which would have in all cases facilitated a way for him to have minimized the losses, including the non-sell of the actual stocks, unless it would have been at the profits, which would have been primarily ignored in favor of the strategy of using them as covers to the options or other mechanisms, which would have generated the ability for each trade to have been fully covered, exponentially compounding the mechanism of the building of the portfolio under Don Boles Sr.'s accounts from David's research, which would have been informing the advisors making the trade, at which point David's education is the support structure of that, which would be accredited to him by Don Sr. when making the other large trades, as Don Sr.'s credit being directly connected to David's profits from that exchange, as is acknowledged as David's value from having created the reports necessary for the trade to have been proven to the tutors or advisors in question would facilitate a specific agreement, which they did not go into any depth with, which would facilitate our exponential compounding profits from these arrangements, which end in the acknowledgement of stopping the major crash, which is a problem for the white nationalists who were, in fact, orchestrating the crash to happen. At which point, if David stops the major crash, then by definition, he is their adversary, generating the tensions and incentivizing the subversion of the rule of law in favor of their terrorist insurrection against civilians without cause, at which point that weakens the American law enforcement function as the Americans loyal to the United States would actively be under greater and greater pressure to cave to the insurrectionists and betray their oaths. So, if you take this into correlation with the use of the trust for the siblings, you would have the engagement, which would have actively conducted the mechanism of trading by giving the order to the brokerages, which would have exponentially been increasing in the value of those accelerations as the engagement of the long-term planning of the holding market value mechanism would have allowed for the long-term restraints of that, facilitating the position of the obligation to have sold them at their highest value, which, being specifically arranged under the specific tax policies, would have specifically been managed under whatever agreement Don Sr. would have made with the rest of them, which, being accredited under David's system, is still just the trades from his reports, which manifest his expert training from extreme youth in the market itself until he's fully confident in David's abilities to have been hyper accelerated into the training for becoming a professional trader, as well as the acceleration into him starting his own brokerage, which the insurrectionists targeting him had every confidence it would have happened with the highest degree of success. Many of the projections with the exchanges of the trust means that they believed that they would not allow the trust to settle on the value without reducing it back to its status quo zero gains function unless the function of the trust had increased by 3 times, which would have allowed the ability to have engaged in the taxation, which would have taken, I think it was like 49% or something, um, allowing for that half to have increased it, at which point it would sustain itself at 1.5% of the original value for the next year, allowing for the exponential trading mechanisms from the frequency of those retradings on the basis of David's reports, facilitating Don Sr.'s educated answer, with the grunts doing the micromanaging of the reports for the educated answer while he negotiates with the actual legal traders who um, would be able to satisfy the rest of whatever he needed to know and to satisfy the rest of the trades on the basis of those recommendations from the projections in the report, normalizing David's work in the function of a brokerage, of managing and functioning the maintenance of the brokerage reporting, which would be normal to the function of the exchange, at which point the engagement building the algorithms for the finding of those pieces of information, essentially increasing them exponentially on the basis of David's private attention, would have maximized the function to the exponential capacity, facilitating the status quo norms of a fully functioning faculty in that specialty before anything becomes truly devoted into the particular area, having already proven it. Maximizing the effect of this on the cross-platform function facilitates the engagement to the maximum returns, which goes into the credit, which is the functional return for David from Don Sr. as his present or whatever agreement they would have engaged with, as the functionality of the investment into that, as the building of the credit facilitates his capacity to receive the loan under their agreements, to have created the finances necessary to have leveraged against the crash of '08 when it was objectively discovered in the projected research found by the obstructors of the markets loyal to the white nationalists, otherwise known as wizard communists, who, having hatred of the United States, have targeted for the insurrection. So if you take the long history of those exchanges, which led up to that projection, you would have actively had the accumulation of highly important friend groups, which would have actively accelerated X, Y, or Z in the cooperation to any of the particular areas, including the promotion from each of the advisors who would be able to verify the value to any particular groups, at which point, if there is an acceleration beyond what would normally be projected in the reputation or value or potential for reputation of any of the parties respectfully, they would be able to be accelerated by the word of mouth verification from the school, which would have actively been reinforcing the connections for uh, all of the business deals which could be generated from those arrangements, and the acknowledgement of the business trades actually being endorsed facilitates the normal pre-trading of contract exchanges, um, with the function of work potential through David's work as a broker, including his education as a broker, which facilitates the ability to conduct work contracts through the brokerage, at which point, instead of it just being stocks and options, you would also be able to do seasonal work, such as your exchanges of buying mangoes or oranges or apples or any of the other function of products, or the engagement of servers or various services and many kinds, which generates the active free market exponentially compounding the job opportunities, which exponentially compounds the access to workers, which accelerates the amount of ability to get the unemployment numbers down, as it is easier to collect them when you have an acted orderly system, which they projected to be. Now, based upon the projections of how quickly everything escalates with those projections and confidences, you would actively have cosigners to contracts and deals, as the acceleration of the mutual use of the brokerage report information facilitates the mechanism of those who are advancing the resources for each of the corporations, such as Don Sr. facilitating the start of the brokerage, as a confidence signal to the functional normalization of the reports from David, which compounds exponentially to the other trades, at which point David doesn't need to be an adult in order for the function to exist under those recommendations, as he follows under the apprenticeship from the School of Hard Knocks, which also facilitates the acceleration of the mutual confidences generated by their contexts, which includes the position that they still assumed that the ability to conduct the air security to stop 9/11 existed, um, from those who actively had knowledge of the terrorist attacks, at which point their ability to facilitate the resources necessary in order for it to have been normalized as an alternative to the military function facilitates their co-capacity outside of the jurisdiction specifically allotted to the plot, at which point those parties, which in the original sense by the military investment into the intelligence, understood that the white nationalists were planning the 9/11 attacks, and their knowledge of that being owed to the general public not being sent is an objective fact of the record, which facilitates the exponential resources into that exception to the jurisdiction effect under David's title, which would have facilitated the stopping of the 9/11 attacks, which, as an accelerant in those positions, would have manufactured naturally without the acknowledgement of David's intelligence oversight functions into the realization of his branch of the highest level of the intelligence oversight, especially after the successful subversion of the terrorist attack, which manufactures the rest of the estimate as all of it exponentially compounds. And since the majority of that is legal, legitimate secrets, there is no way for us to talk about it in any competent way until it would have been naturally declassified, which requires the existence of Congress to acknowledge all of the effects in its proper order, at which point New York was told that David was going to stop the 9/11 attacks. And so, New York, having been told, such as Giuliani, that the 9/11 attacks were going to fail, then he contracted the terrorist attacks against David for the subversion so that he would not be able to stop it, protecting the 9/11 attacks for J. Sekulow's coup. At which point, the extra jurisdictional functions throughout the United States has exponentially compounded the criminal fortitude of the white nationalist secret terrorist operations from their invisible empire. But again, in our example, what if the Americans were in control? The answer is that would fail, and clearly uh, their warrants serve as the projection of what happens if they don't do it. So if J. Sekulow can't win the Civil War, then the warrant qualifies the value that stopped him, and those due diligence include the 9/11 attacks, at which point these values exponentially compound towards the interest. Now, their trades on the basis of influencing David in any particular direction actively have their interests, which also specifically focuses on Nancy Reagan's infatuation with the horoscope functions, which uh, many of the yuppies actively endorse. But since they actively trade on the basis of the hearsay of the horoscopes, they would actively be using it as an incentive in order to facilitate the final manufactured version of their offers as they materialize the status quo function of all of the layers of David's business is exchanged as they trade exponentially off of that. So David's promise to give them allows them to trade in advance that function for their ability to claim the thing in the future, which they have confidence for, which facilitates the military intelligence not being necessary for the existence of all of those engagements. At which point, stopping the crash of '08 would not have been necessary for David to have had many of the support businesses, which would have catastrophically accelerated his credit score and interest in his ability to conduct it, each and every one of the functions, making David the naturally formed self realized patriarch, which many jealous competitors, viewing David as a self absorbed asshole, would have assumed that he would have actively invested in many variations of projections of fractured aspects of his life and how it could have happened in all of the various ways, which he would have scripted into the various aspects of the entertainment in order to increase the propaganda of his own natural ego, at which point the exponential catastrophic functions of how aggressive he projects his enemies would have had to have been in order to accomplish X, Y, or Z would have facilitated the proof to the general public of his natural superiority as a function of bragging through the propaganda, at which point, whether or not that's true, they have full confidence that that happened, which includes their investment into many of the similar overlapping functions, as they, assuming that it's true, would have made the services specifically at which point their anticipation that it's true facilitates their profits of buying the contract ahead of time, at which point David being able to buy it because their projection that it's successful means that he buys it from them and they conducted the service and everyone makes a shit ton of money, which I'm not exactly going to fight them. Which means David is in movies, books, and other entertainment propaganda functions such as the National News Corporation. At which point, the earlier they invest, the higher the margins or separation of lows from highs. The cheaper they buy and the higher they sell, the more money they make off of having sold it to David, which accelerates their interest in money grabbing for information, facilitating their earliest possible investment in order to extort every last possible penny, which facilitates their active engagement in the investment of projections in the future in order for them to engage in pre-profits projections at the highest levels, facilitating the active acceleration of their use of investing into the government for intelligence functions, at which points the more information the government's able to give them, the closer they get to the military intelligence, the earlier they're able to get their high grade cash cows off of knowing who to be friends with. And the active engagement of knowing who to be friends with is not technically insider trading, which allows them to make the easier projections from the parallel construction mechanisms, at which point they are able to make all of the potential massive returns exponentially by having known to be David's best. And as we all know, in business, it's all about location, location, location. So, in every variation, all of David's basic, closest, most reliable friends are work colleagues who, having been able to see the value in David, are basically his friends so that they can become best friends so that they can make fortunes together off of each other's extraordinary talents. And the more talent David is able to accumulate to himself, the faster he accelerates in status and reputation, the more talent he's able to accumulate, which generates higher and higher statuses, which facilitates his acceleration in the fame um, arrangements. At which point, the more value he has, the closer he gets to the top of the famous, and does not have to be famous himself in order to enjoy its glory, which reinforces the assumption of the insurance contracts of the famous engaging in their facilitation of the business meetings at the higher level, which maintains the engagement of their alternative profits to merely engaging in their celebrity functions. At which point, not just doing movies and TV, etc., and they're able to sustain these extraordinary values as a cost of business in those amenities for the business meetings. Now, this is all important because this actively reinforces David's acceleration in the promotion of him throughout the military branches as the top ranked general favored by the troops, generating the jealousy of the white nationalist bureaucrats who, viewing him as a threat to themselves, would actively engage of assisting the enemy in order to subvert him at the various times that they would be able to get away with any particular battle, depending upon which version of reality would have manifested by their non-preemptive actions. So the act of them not preempting the thing facilitates their obstruction at a later date, which actively changes in the overarching military strategy of how and when they want to engage in their military functions against national security. For the fascist coup or the consolidation of the government, which is the subversion of the rule of law, which is the overthrowing of the government, which is the function of being an enemy of the popular government and of its peoples. David's existence, therefore, makes the white nationalist racist system feel endangered, which manifests their retaliation, which proves to the public their existence, which David, being overpowered, would defeat them under their own theory.